The wind on that high prairie was a sculptor of silence, carving the long hours into shapes of loneliness. It worried the dry grass and hummed a low, mournful tune against the weathered silver of the barnwood. Elias knew its language. He had lived so long with only its company and the steady, uncomplicated breathing of his horses that the sound of a human voice felt like a trespass. He was mending the north fence line, his movements economical and practiced, when he saw it. A shape, stumbling where no shape should be, a blot of wrongness against the bruised twilight sky. It was not an animal. It moved with the lurching, desperate gait of a broken thing. Elias dropped his wire cutters, his body tensing with a forgotten instinct, a watchfulness learned in a place far from these plains, a place of noise and dust and fear. He walked towards it, his boots sinking into the thirsty soil. As he drew closer, the wrongness sharpened into a horrifying clarity. It was a person, their hands bound before them with rough twine, and their head, their entire head, was encased in a coarse burlap sack. They tripped, falling to their knees with a choked sound that was swallowed by the immense sky. Elias stopped a few feet away, his heart a hard, slow drum against his ribs. The figure did not move. He knelt, pulling a small, sharp knife from his belt. The twine was thick, biting into the flesh of the wrists beneath. He sawed through it carefully, the fibers parting with a dusty sigh. The hands fell limp. He looked at the sack, at the crude air holes punched near where a mouth might be. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, like a stone scraping stone. A breath hitched inside the burlap. A moment passed, filled only with the ceaseless wind. Then a whisper, so dry and cracked it sounded like autumn leaves skittering across pavement, slipped through the rough fabric. "I'm not for keeping." He carried her to the barn. She was lighter than a bale of hay, a collection of sharp angles and trembling fear. He laid her gently in the clean straw of an empty stall, the one that caught the morning sun. The air in the barn was cool and smelled of horses and sweet feed, a scent of life and routine that stood in stark contrast to the violation she represented. He lit a single lantern, hanging it from a high beam. The light cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar space into a confessional, a sanctuary. He brought a dipper of water from the well, the metal cool against his palm. He held it out, not touching her, just offering. A hand, thin and grimy, with rope burns branding the wrist, reached out and took it. She drank clumsily, tilting the dipper so the water could find the tear in the sack near her mouth. He said nothing. He did not ask to remove the hood. It was a shield, a wall, and he had learned long ago not to tear down another person's defenses. He simply watched, his face a stoic mask that hid the churning discomfort in his gut. This was a trouble he had not invited, a complication in a life he had deliberately pared down to its simplest components. Yet, he could no more turn her out than he could stop the sun from rising. His own ghosts, the ones from the war that stalked the edges of his sleep, would not allow it. He saw the crude stitching that held the sack tight around her collar, the angry red marks on her skin. He saw the faint outline of a slender neck, the slight frame beneath a tattered dress. He pulled up an old wooden crate, sat just outside the stall, and leaned his back against the post. He would stand watch. He didn't know what he was guarding against, only that the wind now seemed to carry whispers of a threat, and the silence of his ranch felt fragile, breakable. The next morning, the light crept into the barn, soft and grey. He had dozed fitfully on the crate, waking to the nicker of his horses. She had not moved from the straw, a still, hooded mound in the corner of the stall. He went to the small cabin he called home, the fire in the wood stove little more than glowing embers. He stirred up a pot of thin oatmeal, adding a spoonful of honey. He carried the bowl to the barn, his steps measured. He placed it on the straw just inside the stall, a few feet from her, and then he retreated, walking to the far end of the barn to mend a piece of tack. He did not look at her, granting her the privacy of his deliberate ignorance. From the corner of his eye, he saw a flicker of movement. A hand, hesitant and bird-like, crept from the shadows and drew the bowl back into the darkness. When he checked later, it was empty, licked clean. The small act of consumption was a victory, a flicker of life asserting itself against whatever darkness had tried to extinguish it. He went about his chores, the rhythm of the work a comfort. He fed the horses, cleaned the stalls, checked the water troughs. But his awareness was stretched thin, tethered to the silent figure in his barn. He saw a plume of dust on the county road, a neighbor on horseback slowing to stare at his property, his curiosity a palpable thing even from a distance. The world was watching. Later, he returned to the barn with a thick wool blanket, one his mother had woven. He folded it carefully and placed it next to the empty bowl. She flinched as he approached, but did not scramble away. He met the blank canvas of the sack, imagining the eyes behind it. His gesture was the only language he had, a quiet declaration, "You are safe here." He backed away, and the great, heavy silence of the barn settled around them once more, no longer empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken fragility. The larder was getting low. A trip to town was an unavoidable necessity, a journey he now dreaded. Leaving her felt like a dereliction of a duty he hadn't fully accepted. The ranch, once his fortress of solitude, had become her sanctuary, and he its unwilling, unswerving guardian. He paused at the barn door, looking back at the stall. There was no sign of her, but he knew she was there, listening. "I'll be back before sundown," he said to the empty air, the words feeling foreign and loud in his throat. The town of Redemption was little more than a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, and a church. It was a place of long memories and short patience. As he stepped into the mercantile, the conversations dwindled. The proprietor, a man named Henderson with eyes that missed nothing, polished the counter with a vigor that was purely for show. "Elias," he said, his tone weighted with meaning. "Need supplies?" A few men loitering by the stove turned to look at him, their gazes a mixture of suspicion and morbid curiosity. "Heard you got company," one of them, a rancher named Cobb, said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby bucket. Elias didn't answer, just placed his list on the counter. "Flour. Salt. Coffee." Henderson gathered the items slowly. "Folks are talking," he murmured, his back to Elias. "Talking about the Miller boys. Say they're looking for something they lost." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The Millers. A hard family from the East Valley, known for their cruel streak and their sour mash whiskey. "Something about their sister," Henderson added, his voice barely a whisper. "The one they call the Millers." Shame. Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He kept his face impassive. He paid for his goods, his movements stiff. On impulse, he added a spool of fine silk thread, a sharp needle, and a small tin of calendula salve to his pile. Henderson raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The silent judgment of the town followed him out the door, sticking to him like burrs. He was no longer just the reclusive soldier, he was a man hiding trouble. He returned as the sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the clouds in violent shades of orange and purple. A profound sense of relief washed over him as he saw the barn, untouched, a silent silhouette against the dying light. He put the supplies away in his cabin, but kept the thread, needle, and salve in his pocket. When he entered the barn, he found her standing at the rail of the stall, a position he had never seen her in before. She was facing the corral, where his horses were gathered. His gaze followed hers to Shadow, a wild-eyed black mare with a spirit as untamed as the prairie wind. Shadow was his challenge, a creature of raw power and deep mistrust that he was slowly, patiently trying to win over. No one else could get near her. The woman in the sack stood perfectly still, but Elias could sense an intensity in her posture, an unnerving focus on the horse. He walked past her, his own movements calm and deliberate, and entered the corral. He didn't look at the mare, but spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, the way he always did. He held out a hand, letting the horse come to him, her nostrils flaring as she tasted his scent. The woman watched his every move, her shrouded head tilted. There was a knowledge in her stillness, a resonance. He felt it like a hum in the air between them. On his way out, he left the corral gate unlatched, swinging just slightly ajar. It was an offering without words, an invitation into his world, a test. He went to a workbench and began to repair a bridle, the scent of leather and oil filling the air. He did not look towards the stall or the corral. He worked and he waited, while the wind whispered secrets through the cracks in the walls. The sound came first, the thunder of hooves and the braying laughter of coarse men. 2 riders crested the hill, moving with an arrogant swagger that violated the peace of the landscape. They were big men, fleshy and red-faced, reeking of entitlement. The Miller boys. They pulled their horses up short in front of the cabin, their eyes scanning the property with a predatory air. Elias stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He felt the woman retreat into the deepest, darkest corner of the barn behind him, a frantic rustling in the straw. Elias, the larger of the 2 brothers, boomed, his voice thick with contempt. "Heard you found something that belongs to us." He spat on the ground near Elias's boots. "We've come for our sister." Elias stood his ground, his body a solid, unmoving presence. He was shorter than them, leaner, but there was a hardness in him they failed to recognize, a stillness learned in places where sudden movements meant death. "There's no one here but me," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The second brother, leaner and with meaner eyes, laughed. "Don't lie to us, old man. The whole county's buzzin'. You're hidin' our shame. Give her back to us. She needs a lesson in respect." They started to dismount, their intentions clear. Elias didn't move, but something in his gaze shifted, hardening to flint. "This is my land," he stated, not as a threat, but as an undeniable fact. "You are not welcome here." "Leave." The brothers hesitated, taken aback by the sheer force of his quiet will. They were used to bluster and fear, not this unyielding calm. They exchanged a look. "This ain't over," the first one growled. "We'll be back. And we'll bring the sheriff next time. He'll see what you're hidden." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a silence thick with menace. That night, the sky broke. The storm that had been threatening for days arrived with a primal fury, rain lashing against the roof of the barn and thunder rattling the very foundations of the earth. The lantern light flickered, casting the interior in a frantic, strobe-like effect. The raw violence of the weather outside seemed to have cracked something open inside. Elias was checking on the horses when she emerged from the stall. She walked towards him, her steps unsteady but resolute. She stopped in the small circle of light cast by the lantern and held out her hand. In her palm lay a small, rusted nail, its point sharpened against a stone. It was a question. A plea. A final surrender of her defenses. He looked from the nail to the blank face of the sack, and he understood. He took the nail from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact was electric, a jolt of shared humanity in the heart of the storm. He motioned for her to sit on a low stool. Gently, with the painstaking precision of a surgeon, he began to work at the crude, thick stitches that bound the burlap to the collar of her dress. The thunder cracked directly overhead, and in the flash of lightning that illuminated the barn, he cut the final thread. The sack fell away from her head, landing in the straw with a soft, final thud. He saw her face. She was younger than he had imagined, her features delicate beneath the grime and exhaustion. Her hair was a tangled mess, but it was her eyes that held him, deep, dark pools of old pain. And then he saw it, seared into the skin of her cheek like a cattle brand. A crude, jagged letter M. Miller. The mark of their possession, their shame. Her throat worked, and a voice, raw and broken, filled the small space between them. They said I was born too rough for a saddle. The morning after the storm was scrubbed clean, the air sharp and new. A fragile peace had settled over the ranch, the tension of the previous days replaced by a raw, uncertain vulnerability. He saw her from the cabin window, standing by the corral. She was no longer a shrouded mystery, but a person, her face pale in the dawnlight, the cruel brand on her cheek a stark reminder of her past. She stood watching the black mare, Shadow, who watched her in return. There was a stillness between them, a communication that bypassed human language. He watched as she slipped through the unlatched gate. He expected the mare to bolt, to rear up in a panic as she did with everyone else. But she didn't. Shadow stood her ground, her ears pricked forward, her dark eyes fixed on the approaching girl. The girl, Lila, he decided that was her name, for she looked like she had bloomed in the night, didn't approach with a rope or a handful of oats. She approached with silence. She stopped a few feet away and simply stood, breathing in rhythm with the horse. Then, she murmured something too low for him to hear, a sound like the wind itself. The mare took a hesitant step towards her, then another, until her soft nose was touching Lila's outstretched hand. Elias watched, his breath caught in his chest. It was like watching a miracle unfold. With a single, fluid motion that spoke of innate, forgotten grace, Lila swung herself onto the mare's bare back. There was no resistance. No fight. Horse and rider stood as one, a perfect, impossible silhouette against the rising sun. Then they moved. Not a panic bolt, but a controlled, powerful canter around the corral. She rode as if she were a part of the horse, an extension of its wild spirit. Elias finally understood. It wasn't that she was too rough for a saddle, it was that her spirit was too vast to be contained by one. Her brothers hadn't been trying to break her for riding, they had been trying to break her spirit because it was something they could never hope to match or control. They came back at dusk, as he knew they would. This time there were 3 of them, their forms dark against the fading light. They had been drinking, he could smell the sour mash on the air from 50 yards away. They rode with a grim purpose, their earlier bluster replaced by a sullen, violent resolve. Elias was waiting on the porch, but he was not alone. Lila was beside him, astride Shadow, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the mare's neck. She wore a clean shirt he had left for her, her hair was brushed, and her face, though still bearing its mark, was set with a quiet defiance that was more powerful than any weapon. The Miller brothers pulled up, their jaws dropping in disbelief at the sight of her. They saw not the hooded, broken thing they had discarded, but a woman unveiled and untamed, mounted on a horse they knew to be unbreakable. "Get down from there," the eldest brother snarled, recovering his composure. "You're coming with us." He made a move to dismount, to grab at Shadow's reins. That was his mistake. Elias moved from the porch in a blur of quiet efficiency. He was not a brawler, he was a soldier. He used the first brother's momentum against him, twisting his arm and sending him sprawling into the dust. The second brother charged, swinging a fist. Elias sidestepped, his hand striking a nerve cluster in the man's neck. The man went down, gasping. The third, seeing his brother so easily dispatched, turned his attention to the true prize. He lunged for Lila. But he never reached her. With a subtle pressure from Lila's knees, Shadow reared, her powerful body a wall of black muscle, her front hooves striking the air with lethal force. The man scrambled back, terror replacing the rage in his eyes. Lila leaned forward, her voice no longer a dry whisper but clear and steady, carrying on the evening air. "I'm not for keeping." It was not a plea. It was a judgment. The brothers, defeated and humiliated, gathered their groaning companion and retreated into the darkness, their power broken, their shame now their own to carry. In the ringing silence that followed their departure, the world seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the mare and the low moan of the wind. Elias stood in the yard, a dull ache starting in his knuckles. He looked at Lila, still mounted on Shadow, a figure of impossible strength against the twilight. She was the one who had been branded, shamed, and left for dead, and yet, in the end, she had been her own rescuer. She dismounted, her movements fluid and sure. She stroked the mare's neck, calming her with a low murmur. Then she turned and walked towards him. He expected her to go into the barn or the cabin, to retreat back into the silence they had shared. Instead, she stopped in front of him. She looked at the fresh scrape on his cheek where the second brother's ring had caught him. Hesitantly, as if still unlearning a lifetime of flinching from human touch, she raised her hand and gently, so gently, brushed her fingers against his skin. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, of gratitude, of a shared victory. It said more than words ever could. He did not pull away. He simply stood there, under the vast and darkening sky, and allowed himself to be touched. The quiet that settled over the ranch that night was different from the solitude that had come before. It was a shared quiet, a stillness for two. It was the sound of peace. The story of the Miller boys' defeat spread through the county like a grass fire, the gossip in town shifting from suspicion to a kind of grudging awe. In time, the family sold their land and moved on, their name fading from memory. Elias and Lila never spoke of that first night, or the brothers, or the burlap sack he had quietly burned in the wood stove. They didn't need to. Their past was a silent understanding that bound them closer than any vow. They worked the ranch together, moving in a seamless rhythm of shared purpose. She had a gift not just with horses, but with all wounded things. He found, to his own surprise, that the ghosts of his past had grown quiet, soothed by her steady presence. The brand on her cheek slowly faded into a faint, silvery scar, a map of where she had been. Their life was a quiet one, written not in words, but in the trust of a wild horse, the warmth of a shared fire, and the steady, comforting sound of two sets of hoofbeats riding together across the hard-packed earth.